I cannot believe she has shown her face.
They say her family fortune is quite gone.
And in that dress.
Lady Corbin's musical evening was the sort of genteel torture that London society excelled at inflicting upon itself. Penelope arrived unfashionably late, which was to say, at the precise moment when her entrance would cause maximum disruption. The soprano's aria faltered mid-note as heads turned toward the doorway. She had chosen her armor carefully. The gown was new, a deep sapphire silk that her former husband would have deemed too bold, too attention-seeking for a woman of her modest charms. Her maid had arranged her chestnut hair in an elaborate style that whispered of confidence rather than screaming for approval. Most significantly, she wore her mother's pearls at her throat instead of hidden away in their velvet box, a talisman against the whispers she knew would follow her. Miss Hartwell, Lady Corbin greeted her with the sort of brittle warmth reserved for social curiosities. "How brave of you to join us." Brave. The word society used when they meant foolish, scandalous, or pitiable. I've discovered bravery is remarkably easy when one stops caring about the opinions of tedious people, Penelope replied, her voice carrying just far enough to reach the nearest cluster of gossips. She swept past her hostess into the music room, acutely aware of every eye tracking her movement. There, in the third row, sat Marcus with his current companion, a giggling blonde whose laugh could strip paint from walls. He noticed Penelope, his expression cycling through surprise, discomfort, and finally settling on the bland indifference he'd perfected during their marriage. Penelope smiled at him. A real smile this time, edged with something that might have been pity or triumph or simply relief that she would never again have to pretend his presence mattered. Then she took a seat in the front row, directly in everyone's line of sight, and prepared to enjoy the music. The soprano resumed her aria, though her performance had acquired a nervous quality that suggested she, like everyone else in the room, was more interested in the drama unfolding in the audience than in Bellini's compositional genius. Penelope focused on the music with genuine appreciation. During her marriage, she'd forgotten how much she enjoyed these evenings, not the social performance of them, but the actual art. Marcus had found her enthusiasm for culture exhausting, and her attempts at intelligent conversation pedantic. She'd learned to sit silent and decorative, her opinions withering from disuse like flowers denied sunlight. "She's handling it rather well, don't you think?" a voice murmured from the seat beside her. Penelope turned to find an elderly woman watching her with shrewd, kind eyes. Lady Thornbury, she realized, a dowager countess whose reputation for plain speaking had made her both feared and respected in equal measure. "Handling what, my lady?" Penelope asked, though she knew perfectly well. "Being the evening's entertainment." Lady Thornbury's lips quirked. "Half the room is waiting for you to collapse in tears. The other half is wagering on whether you'll throw your fan at your former husband's head. I have £10 on you doing neither, so please don't disappoint me." Despite herself, Penelope laughed, a genuine sound that rang out during a particularly quiet musical passage. More heads swiveled. Marcus's companion whispered something behind her fan, and Marcus's jaw tightened in that particular way that meant he was embarrassed. Good, Penelope thought with savage satisfaction. Let him feel a fraction of the humiliation he'd served her for 3 years. "I wouldn't waste a perfectly good fan on him," Penelope whispered back. "They're dreadfully expensive." Lady Thornbury's laugh was like champagne bubbles, bright and effervescent and utterly delightful. The musicale concluded to polite applause, and society's true purpose for gathering could commence, the systematic dissection of everyone's reputation, wardrobe, and romantic entanglements. Penelope found herself swept into Lady Thornbury's orbit, introduced to a constellation of women whose names she recognized but had never been important enough to actually meet during her marriage. "My grandson is around here somewhere," Lady Thornbury announced, scanning the crowd with the focused intensity of a general surveying a battlefield. "Probably hiding in the library, the antisocial creature. He despises these affairs but humors me because I'm ancient and terrifying." "A sensible man, then," Penelope observed, accepting a glass of champagne from a passing footman. "Sensible. Wealthy. Titled beyond all reason." Lady Thornbury ticked off attributes on her fingers. "Also brooding, overly serious, and convinced that smiling will somehow compromise his dignity. I blame his father. My son had all the warmth of a January morning. The boy inherited his temperament along with the dukedom. A duke? Of course. London was littered with them like particularly expensive cobblestones. Lady Thornbury, I hope you're not attempting to matchmake, Penelope said carefully. I've only just escaped one marriage. I have no intention of entering another. Matchmake? Good heavens, child, I'm far too old for such nonsense. The dowager's eyes sparkled with mischief. I simply thought you might enjoy meeting someone who also finds most of society unbearably dull. Consider it a public service, saving two interesting people from terminal boredom. Before Penelope could protest, Lady Thornbury was propelling her through the crowd with surprising vigor for a woman of her advanced years, toward the French doors that opened onto Lady Corbin's garden. The garden offered blessed relief from the overheated drawing room and its suffocating curiosity. Lanterns hung from the trees, casting pools of golden light across the gravel paths. Penelope breathed deeply, letting the cool evening air settle her nerves. There you are, Lady Thornbury declared triumphantly, addressing a tall figure half hidden in shadows near an ornamental fountain. Stop lurking like some Gothic villain and come meet Miss Hartwell. Miss Hartwell, my grandson, the Duke of Ravenscroft. The man stepped into the light, and Penelope's breath caught, not from attraction, though he was objectively handsome in that severe, classical way that suggested ancient marble statues, but from recognition. She had seen him before, years ago, at her wedding breakfast. He'd been a guest of Marcus's family, had stayed barely an hour before departing with what she'd interpreted as barely concealed relief at escaping the festivities. He'd looked bored then. He looked bored now, his grey eyes surveying her with the same polite disinterest one might show a moderately interesting painting. Miss Hartwell. His voice was deep, cultured, and completely devoid of warmth. He bowed with mechanical precision. I trust you're enjoying the evening. Not particularly, Penelope replied honestly. The music was excellent, but the company leaves much to be desired. Present company excluded, of course. That earned her a flicker of interest. His eyebrow rose fractionally, which on a face as controlled as his was practically a declaration of surprise. How refreshingly honest, he said, and there might have been the ghost of amusement in his tone. Most people lie and claim they're having a wonderful time. I've discovered I'm tired of lying, Penelope said. Lady Thornbury had mysteriously vanished, leaving them alone beside the fountain. The breach of propriety should have concerned Penelope, but she found she'd exhausted her capacity for caring about such things. Let society gossip. They would anyway. My grandmother is about as subtle as cannon fire, the Duke observed, watching the dowager's retreat with resigned affection. She's been attempting to introduce me to eligible ladies with alarming frequency lately. I'm not eligible, Penelope said quickly. That is, I'm recently divorced. So technically eligible, I suppose, but hardly desirable by society's standards. I'm socially contaminated. Contaminated, he repeated, as though testing the word. What a peculiar way to describe yourself. It's what they're all thinking. Penelope gestured toward the house, where silhouettes moved behind the curtains. The divorced woman who had the audacity to show her face in public rather than retiring to the country in shame. I'm either pitied or scorned, depending on who's doing the talking. The Duke studied her with unsettling focus. You don't seem particularly ashamed. Should I be? The question emerged sharper than intended. My former husband found me tedious. I found him insufferable. We've gone our separate ways with minimal bloodshed. I consider it a successful conclusion to an unsuccessful union. Tedious, the Duke said slowly. That's an interesting accusation. What exactly constitutes tedious in your former husband's estimation? Penelope considered whether to answer honestly. The champagne had loosened her tongue, and there was something almost liberating about conversing with someone who didn't know her history, who wasn't measuring her words against her past failures. I read too much. Expressed opinions on subjects ladies aren't supposed to understand. Laughed at inappropriate moments. Failed to simper convincingly. She shrugged. Essentially, I committed the cardinal sin of being myself rather than the ornamental wife he'd imagined. Then your former husband, the Duke said with deliberate precision, is a fool. The statement hung between them, unexpected and oddly intimate. Penelope had braced herself for polite sympathy or worse, agreement with Marcus's assessment. She had not anticipated this quiet vindication from a man who barely knew her. "You're very kind," she began, but he cut her off with a gesture. "I'm not kind. I'm observant." He moved closer, and Penelope caught the scent of sandalwood and something darker, like old books and rain. "In the quarter hour since we've met, you've demonstrated more genuine wit than most people manage in a lifetime of conversation. If that's tedious, then I suspect your former husband preferred his companions decorative and silent." "He did, rather." Penelope found herself smiling despite the bitter memories. "He once told me that my thoughts on agricultural reform were unbecoming of a lady. I'd merely suggested that crop rotation might improve yields on his estate." "Were you correct?" "According to his steward's reports the following year, exceedingly so. Marcus never acknowledged it, of course." The Duke's expression darkened. "I attended your wedding," he said abruptly. 4 years ago. I remember thinking you looked terrified during the breakfast, as though you'd just realized what you'd committed yourself to." I had. The admission escaped before Penelope could think better of it. "My father arranged the match. Marcus needed a wife from a respectable family. I needed," she stopped, unwilling to confess that she'd needed escape from her father's house, from a future as an unpaid companion to her married sisters. "It doesn't matter now what I needed. I've learned to provide for myself." "How?" The question was direct, almost intrusive, but genuine curiosity animated his features for the first time. Penelope hesitated. She told no one about her work, partly from pride, partly from the lingering shame that Marcus had instilled in her about having practical skills. Ladies weren't supposed to work. They were supposed to arrange flowers and pay social calls and produce heirs. But the Duke was watching her with something that looked remarkably like respect, and the champagne made her bold. "I translate," she said. "French and Italian texts, primarily. Academic papers, occasionally novels. A publisher's house in Bloomsbury employs me under a pseudonym. It's not grand, but it's mine." The Duke's entire demeanor transformed. His shoulders relaxed fractionally, and when he spoke, genuine warmth colored his voice for the first time. "My grandmother will be insufferable when she discovers this. She's been after me for years to fund a translations project for the British Museum. They've a collection of Italian manuscripts on Renaissance art that no one can adequately render into English." "I know," Penelope said, then caught herself. "That is, I've heard of them. The curator mentioned the collection in a lecture last winter." "You attended a lecture at the British Museum." Not a question, but a statement tinged with something that might have been approval. "Marcus forbade it, actually. Said it was inappropriate for his wife to be seen at such events without him, and he had no interest in dusty scholarship." Penelope met the Duke's gaze directly. "So I went anyway, with my maid as chaperone. I went every Thursday for 6 months until he discovered it. That was when he began calling me tedious in earnest." "Miss Hartwell," the Duke said, and there was steel beneath the silk of his tone, "I'm beginning to think your former husband used tedious when he meant threatening. You outmatched him intellectually, and he lacked the character to appreciate it." No one had ever said anything like that to her before. Not her father, who'd viewed her education as an unfortunate expense. Not her sisters, who'd found her reading habits peculiar. Certainly not Marcus, who'd made her feel as though her mind was somehow defective, too sharp and too curious for proper feminine softness. "I outmatched him in nothing," Penelope said quietly. "He was perfectly content. I was the problem, too serious, too opinionated, too everything he didn't want." "Then he wanted the wrong things." The certainty in the Duke's voice did strange things to Penelope's carefully constructed composure. She'd spent 3 years learning to make herself smaller, quieter, less, and here was this severe, imposing man suggesting that small and quiet and less were somehow the failures, not her. "You don't know me," she said, but there was no heat in it. "You're being kind to your grandmother's friend." "I told you, I'm not kind." He held her gaze. "But I am selfish. I've endured precisely 47 of these musicals this season, and this is the first time I've enjoyed a conversation. I'm loath to cut it short simply because society dictates we shouldn't be alone in gardens together." 47? Despite everything, Penelope laughed. "That's remarkably specific." "I've been counting. It seemed the only way to survive them." The admission was so unexpected, so genuinely absurd, that Penelope's laugh deepened into something real and unguarded. When she looked up, she found the Duke watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. "There," he said softly. "That's what I wanted to see." "What?" "You, laughing. Genuinely, not the polite version people perform at jokes they don't find amusing." His voice had dropped, intimate in the garden's shadows. "When you entered Lady Corbin's drawing room tonight, you looked like a woman preparing for battle. Now you look alive." The observation was too acute, too close to the raw truth of her. Penelope took a step back, suddenly aware of how near they stood, how the lantern light gilded his features, how improper this all was. "I should return inside," she said, though she made no move to do so. "Your grandmother will think we've murdered each other." "She'll think nothing of the sort. She'll be planning our wedding and selecting china patterns." The Duke's mouth quirked, not quite a smile, but close enough to transform his austere features into something approaching warmth. "Fair warning, she's relentless once she's decided on something." "Then you'd better disabuse her of the notion immediately," Penelope said firmly. "I've just escaped one marriage. I have no intention of entertaining another, particularly not with a man who counts musical evenings like a prisoner marking days on a cell wall." "Particularly not." He seized on the phrase. "That suggests there might be some circumstances under which you'd consider it." "A figure of speech, nothing more." "Pity." The word was soft, almost lost beneath the rustle of leaves in the evening breeze. "I was rather hoping you might tolerate my company again. Perhaps at the British Museum? Thursday afternoons, I believe you said." Penelope's heart did something complicated in her chest, not the desperate flutter of infatuation, but something more dangerous. Hope, perhaps, or the first stirring of genuine interest. Before she could respond, voices echoed from the house, Lady Thornbury's carrying tones rising above the general murmur, calling for her grandson. The spell of the garden moment fractured. "Duty summons," the Duke said, regret evident in his voice. "But Miss Hartwell, I meant what I said. Thursday at the British Museum. 2 o'clock. I'll be the one examining the Botticelli studies." He bowed, formal once more, and strode back toward the house. Penelope remained by the fountain, her thoughts in pleasant chaos. She should refuse. Should maintain her hard-won independence and avoid complications with titled men who probably collected broken women the way some collected butterflies. But he'd called her intelligent. Had listened to her opinions without condescension. Had looked at her as though she were a puzzle worth solving rather than a decoration requiring proper arrangement. When Penelope finally returned inside, she discovered the evening's entertainment had shifted from music to scandal. Marcus stood near the refreshment table, his face mottled with anger, while his blonde companion simpered and cooed beside him. Several guests were whispering behind fans, their gazes darting between Marcus and the French doors through which Penelope had just entered. Lady Thornbury materialized at her elbow. "Well, my dear, you've caused quite a stir. Apparently, being seen in private conversation with the Duke of Ravenscroft is more interesting than your divorce. Society does love a good romantic speculation." "There's nothing romantic about it," Penelope protested, but even as she spoke, she felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Of course not," Lady Thornbury agreed, her eyes twinkling with unholy amusement. "Nothing at all. Which is why my grandson is currently staring at you like you've just solved a particularly vexing mathematical equation." Thursday arrived wrapped in unseasonable warmth, the kind of London spring day that made even the sooty streets seem almost romantic. Penelope told herself she was going to the British Museum because she'd planned to go anyway, that the Duke's invitation had merely coincided with her existing intentions. She told herself this lie repeatedly while selecting her dress, a soft gray that brought out the green in her eyes, and while arranging her hair with more care than a simple academic outing warranted. The museum was blessedly quiet, most of fashionable London preferring Hyde Park social theatre to dusty scholarship. Penelope found the Duke exactly where he'd promised, standing before a collection of Botticelli's preliminary sketches, his profile severe and focused. "Miss Hartwell." He turned as she approached, and the warmth in his expression made her decision to come feel suddenly significant. "I wasn't certain you'd appear." "I almost didn't," she admitted. "This feels dangerously like courtship, and I've sworn off such things." "Then let's call it something else. A meeting of minds. A mutual appreciation of Renaissance art." He gestured to the sketches. "Tell me, what do you see when you look at these?" Penelope studied the delicate lines, the half-formed figures that would eventually become the birth of Venus. "I see someone working toward perfection, making mistakes, trying again. The finished painting is beautiful, but these sketches, they're honest. They show the struggle behind the beauty." The Duke was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had lost its formal edge. "My wife died 3 years ago. Childbirth. Neither she nor the babe survived." The confession struck Penelope silent. This was not drawing-room conversation, not the careful dance of courtship. This was truth, raw and unadorned. "I'm sorry," she said inadequately. "Everyone is sorry. But no one knows what to say after sorry, so they avoid me instead. I've become London's melancholy Duke, too tragic for polite company." He turned to face her fully. "You're the first person in 3 years who's spoken to me without that careful pity in your voice. Who's looked at me and seen a man rather than a tragedy." "Perhaps," Penelope said slowly, "because I know what it's like to be reduced to a single story. The boring wife. The divorcee. The woman who wasn't enough." "You were enough," he said with quiet intensity. "You were more than enough." He was insufficient. The words settled around Penelope's heart like a benediction. For 3 years, she'd carried Marcus's rejection like a fundamental truth about her worth. But standing here, with this stern Duke who counted musical evenings and quoted Italian art and looked at her like she was something precious and rare, that truth began to crack. "I don't know how to do this," she confessed. "How to trust that someone sees me clearly and doesn't find me wanting." "Then we'll learn together," the Duke said. "I don't know how to let someone see me clearly either. I've been hiding behind my title and my grief for so long I've almost forgotten there's a person underneath." He offered his arm. "Shall we examine the Raphael collection? I understand they've recently acquired several of his correspondence. Your translation skills might prove invaluable." Penelope took his arm, and for the first time since her marriage had crumbled, she felt something that wasn't relief or determination or carefully constructed independence. She felt possibility. 2 years later, on another spring evening, Penelope stood in the Ravenscroft library, her library now, though she still marveled at the possessive, surrounded by translations in various stages of completion. The Italian manuscripts from the British Museum spread across 3 tables, her notes filling leather journals stacked in neat rows. The door opened, and Julian, she'd earned the right to his given name 6 months into their courtship, entered with their daughter balanced on his hip. Little Margaret was all dark curls and imperious expressions, already demonstrating her father's intensity and her mother's curiosity. "She refused her nap," Julian announced, "because, and I quote, Mama's books are more interesting than sleeping." Penelope laughed and took their daughter, who immediately grabbed for the nearest manuscript. "Darling, those are 400 years old. Let's find you something more durable to destroy." "I've been thinking," Julian said, settling into his chair with the ease of a man completely comfortable in his space, "about expanding the East Wing. Your work has outgrown this library. The library is perfect. The library is bursting. You've translated 14 manuscripts this year alone, and the museum has requested 20 more." He looked at her with that expression he'd developed, pride mixed with amusement mixed with something deeper. "My brilliant wife needs proper workspace." My brilliant wife. Marcus had called her tedious. Julian called her brilliant, and meant it, and proved it by reading every translation she produced, by attending her lectures, by sitting in the British Museum on Thursday afternoons discussing art and history and everything else that made her incandescently happy. Have you heard? Lady Thornbury swept into the room with her usual dramatic flair, proving that age had not diminished her ability to make an entrance. Marcus Hartwell has married again. Some insipid creature with a sizable dowry and no opinions whatsoever. They're reportedly very happy, which is to say, she agrees with everything he says and is free to pretend he's clever. How fortunate for them both, Penelope said serenely, and meant it. Marcus's happiness or misery no longer concerned her. He'd released her to find her real life, and for that alone, she was grateful. Meanwhile, Lady Thornbury continued, settling beside her great-granddaughter with practiced ease, my grandson has transformed from London's most eligible melancholy duke into its most besotted husband. Society finds it disgustingly romantic. Society, Julian observed dryly, can mind its own affairs. But he was smiling as he said it, and when Penelope met his gaze across the library, she saw everything she'd never thought to find: partnership, respect, genuine affection, and the daily joy of being known completely and loved precisely because of, not despite, who she was. Freedom, she'd discovered that rainy day 2 years ago, had tasted like possibility. Love, she learned now, tasted like home. As for Marcus Hartwell, he lived contentedly with his silent wife in his comfortable house, never quite understanding why he occasionally felt the absence of something he'd discarded as tedious. His new bride agreed with everything, demanded nothing, and bored him to the depths of his soul within 6 months. But he'd made his choice, and pride prevented him from acknowledging the mistake. Some men, Penelope thought without bitterness, were determined to learn their lessons too late. She'd learned hers exactly when she needed to, that being called boring by the wrong person was infinitely preferable to being cherished by the right one. Did this story touch your heart? Does it remind you that your worth isn't determined by those who fail to see it? Subscribe to our channel for more tales of second chances, hard-won happiness, and the courage it takes to choose yourself. Share this story with someone who needs to hear that being too much for the wrong person means you're exactly enough for the right one. Hit that notification bell, because every week, we bring you stories of remarkable women who refuse to dim their light for anyone. Your story matters. Your voice matters. And you deserve to be cherished for exactly who you are.